You know what's worse than not being able to paint well? Becoming so good at copying photos that everyone else loves your work while you secretly feel like a photocopier. So this is really common, but for one of my mentees, she was stuck in this trap for years, but she broke out of it with just a day's worth of work. And a year later, she had a body of work that got her into one of the top galleries in the country, and all of her work is selling. Let me show you how. One of the first really big problems that actually gets us into this cycle of just copying photos is that we are overwhelmed by choice. It's kind of like walking into a gelato shop where they have like dozens of flavors to choose from. It can be really, really overwhelming. When this happens in our own painting practice, we tend to get kind of paralyzed by this when it comes to what to paint and how we want to paint it. And so we kind of just default to what's easy, like what's right there on the reference. So in order to actually solve this problem, what we have to do is we have to narrow down your choices. This is exactly what I did for Karen, the painter that I was just mentioning. Think of it as you would that gelato example. You walk in there, you see so many flavors, you're stuck, you don't know what to actually choose. What do you do first? Well, you probably ask the person behind the stand, what do people like? Then they tell you some of their most popular flavors. Then you narrow it down by how that intersects with like your own taste. So maybe you really don't like nuts, or you absolutely love chocolate, and that lets you kind of whittle it down further. Now it's much easier to choose. As I go along, I'm going to actually be working through this in workbook form to make it super easy to follow. If you would like to do this for yourself, you can grab your copy down in the description and follow along. Here's essentially how we're going to make this easier for your painting practice, in case you're wondering like what the heck gelato has to do with art making. We can think of your choice of what to be painting as kind of like a funnel. So I have my funnel here. At the top, we have like all art. This is like anything you could choose to paint from. Then we can filter this down into like good art or art other people like. So we have good art. And then at the bottom, we have your taste. This is really the name of the game here for this step. What we want to do is we want to be filtering out the art that you like from just all of the art possibilities. So here's what I actually want you to do. And I have this written down all in the workbook, just in case. The first thing is I want you to create somewhere to start storing and remembering what art you like, what you respond to. I want you to include anything that catches your eye. I also don't want you to worry about like judging it, filtering it down, curating it down, analyzing it. Don't worry about those pieces. And I want you to go ahead and do a first pass now. So like right after you watch this video, or even as you watch it, go ahead and start adding pieces to this collection. For today, the goal is just to get a working collection of art that you like. Over time, you're probably going to keep adding to this as you see new artwork that you really love. But I don't want perfect to be the enemy of done, so I want you to go ahead and just have a first pass that you complete today with the understanding that over time you're going to be adding to it. Why are we going through this step? Again, this has to do with like the overwhelm that actually leads us to just copy the photos that we see. We need to be whittling this down. And so what identifying your taste actually accomplishes is it tells you, hey, here are the things that I personally resonate with, and it's going to cut down some of that like overwhelm or decision paralysis that can come up. What taste is really good at is showing you what you would hang on your wall. But obviously that doesn't get us all the way there. A lot of us are really in tune with what our taste is, and yet we're still just kind of like stuck copying our reference material without feeling like we're putting our own voices into our work. So if taste is what you would hang on your wall, voice is the work you can't live without having created for yourself. Here's an example of what I mean. So when I'm not painting, I am dancing. This is one of my other passions. And I've been doing this for a really long time. I've learned a whole lot of dances, but not too long ago, I was in a phase where I was having to learn a new dance, the paso doble. And my instructor, who was super enthusiastic, was like, all right, I'm gonna play some music. I want you to just dance from the heart. And I just stood there. Like, I could not figure out how to put one foot in front of the other. And I realized, and what I had to explain to my teacher in the moment was, I can recognize a paso doble when someone else dances it, but I don't actually know how to do the steps. Like, I don't know how to make my body look like that. And this relates to painting because it's not enough to just be able to recognize what you like. You actually need the tools to be able to create it. And that's really what we're starting to drive at with this second step in the process. So we're not just saying, keep painting and keep following your heart and your voice is going to emerge. That's probably just going to yield frustration. So here's how I like to think about this in a way that is way more simple and honestly way more actionable. We want to think about voice as the intersection of a few different things. So in the center of this Venn diagram is voice. Here's what voice is actually made of. First, it is your taste. So the kind of art that you love. Next, we have your preferred medium. And then finally, we have your ideal process or technique. So the intersection of all of these, your voice is actually going to emerge. So going back to our workbook here, again, you can grab yours in the description if you want to follow along with this, because it's going to outline all of these steps. First things first, we're going to take a look at that taste collection that you already put together. And we're going to start to filter pieces down using a few very specific criteria. Ask yourself, for instance, if I could only keep a handful of these to represent the pieces that I personally feel like I couldn't live without having painted myself or, painted something like it, what would those pieces be? That kind of represents like the best of the best when it comes to your taste. Next, we can ask, are these the right medium? So this is a really important one. If you're watching this channel, it's hopefully because you're an oil painter. What we want to do is we want to filter out paintings that you love that just don't happen to be oil paintings. This is really going to help us down the road because it can be really difficult to figure out how to translate, for instance, like watercolor technique into oil. So just trust me with this, pick oil paintings. It's going to make this way easier. And then the last key question that I want you to ask is, would I actually enjoy the process of painting the way that this piece requires? So, for example, I'm going to use Bouguereau, like absolutely extraordinary portrait and figure painter. His work is so stunning, and it's the kind of painting that would absolutely show up on my inspiration board. It's definitely a feature of my taste, and it could even be like the top of my taste, potentially. But here's the problem with Bouguereau. Those paintings take a really long time to paint, and that is just not the kind of painter I am. So I need to be comfortable leaving that as, all right, this is great, but it's my taste. It's not my personal approach. Instead, I really just want to be looking for the pieces that have an approach that I love. So example, someone like John Singer Sargent or Richard Schmid, they're much more likely to have the process of painting that I'm going to personally resonate with. What we want to do is we want to create a new collection of paintings that just check all of these 3 boxes. For me personally, I typically put this on Pinterest. I have other YouTube videos where I show that process. But the long and short is that you simply want to copy over the ones that are checking all the boxes into some place where you can see them all at the same time. It can be a folder on your computer, it can be Pinterest, it can be so many different tools, but for the sake of simplicity, let's just pretend that we're going to put all of these onto Pinterest. As you're creating this little subset of work that's meant to represent your voice, here's some other questions you can also ask, and don't worry, this is all covered in your workbook. You can look at things like what subjects are being depicted here. So for instance, I really love Daniel Key's paintings. He is primarily a floral painter. That being said, I realized through doing this exercise that I much prefer painting portraits. So I'm probably going to leave out Daniel's floral work and instead try and find some of his portrait work. Essentially, I want to make sure that I'm filtering out subjects that aren't what I'm obsessed with or would be really, really passionate about painting. You can also look at things like color. Is this the kind of color palette that you are interested in painting? One other thing you can look at would just be how easy would it be to get reference material for this piece. So for instance, if you have a ton of landscapes of, the Grand Canyon, and you live nowhere near the Grand Canyon and don't have any plans to visit, all right, that might not be the ideal subject for your particular voice. Just keep in mind, how easy would it be for you to actually get the material you need to paint that subject as you're picking what subjects to include. But at the end of the day, really, the main thing we're looking for is, would I absolutely love painting this and having painted it? Would I be incredibly proud to make this? Would I be able to go into the studio and do it every day? And just like that, we have actually taken that filter that we were talking about earlier, and not only have we identified your taste, but we figured out what it is you want to paint. Once you've done this, a lot of painters already feel a lot of clarity because they can look at this collection of work and think this was the thing that I was missing. I look at this and I feel really energized. I want to go into the studio. I feel really ready to dive in and start painting something like this. But sometimes there's still just one little roadblock that's stopping you from being able to take action on it. And that is that looking at all of these pieces that you've just compiled, they might excite you and they might give you a really clear sense of the feeling you want to evoke in your work, but a feeling isn't an action plan for the studio. We want to actually decode your voice and turn it into an easy checklist you can follow in order to create a body of work that is in your voice and that feels special and that reflects what you really want to say in your art. I think it's helpful to think about painting kind of like magic. We are all magicians doing this. I don't know if you've ever heard someone tell you that after they've watched you paint, but I know it's really common for people to walk up to painters and say what you do is magic. And that's not a coincidence. What's happening is that the person who's watching you paint is filled with this sense of wonder. They're filled with emotion. And there's also this thing of they don't know how you're doing it. But here's the thing. The magician who is performing a trick, who is creating that feeling of wonder or awe in the onlooker, the magician is by definition disillusioned. They know what illusion they're trying to create, but they also understand the inner workings that actually make it possible. And so what we have to do is we have to go from looking at the work that we love and also being filled with this sense of wonder and awe and kind of succumbing to the illusion of it. We have to reverse engineer the steps that create that illusion. We have to disillusion ourselves. That's how we crack the code and actually be able to create that for ourselves. So the way that we can think about solving this problem is kind of broken into 3 phases. So I'm going to make these into little triangles. I guess we can think of them as arrows. So the first step is to feel it. It's basically to be able to look at this body of work and name the kind of subjective qualities that you feel that you're responding to in it. So maybe they're moody, or maybe there's a sense of nostalgia in them. Maybe they feel like that feeling you had in childhood of like wonder or awe, whatever it is. So we're going to feel it first, then we're going to name it. So what we're referring to there is we're going to actually kind of break down what's creating the feeling and describe it in a more concrete way that's going to give us steps to follow. And then the last step is to paint it. This is how we're going to actually create an action plan for you. So the feeling comes first, but it isn't usable until we've broken down what's creating the feeling and we turn it into a step that you can follow when you're in front of the easel. I'm going to go ahead and go back to my workbook here. And this is going to give you a series of prompts. So for instance, if I take a look at my inspiration board that is designed to capture my voice, one thing I see over and over again is that these are portrait paintings. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start taking those kinds of notes when it comes to subject. For me, for instance, like, yes, these tend to be head and shoulders. There really aren't like still life elements in these. There's not a lot of props or anything in the background. They're not like landscape paintings. I would also add for my particular style that I would say these are like vignettes with abstract backgrounds. And by abstract, I mean like very painterly. Okay, so this is going to walk us through the very first question, which is subject. This could be, or at least it should be, something that's like pretty straightforward for all of you to be able to answer. Next, we have composition. So essentially, how is the subject arranged? This can also include things like, what is the scope of the painting? So you might know that you really want to paint people, but there's a big difference between a painting that's cropped like here, head and shoulders, versus a painting that has 10 people in it. There's also considerations like, what is the angle of the viewer relative to the subject? All sorts of things like that. So, and I already had actually captured the abstracted backgrounds piece. I would not say that mine really feature full interiors. I would say that it is cropped very close to the subject. Next, we're going to talk lighting. So let's try to imagine what light source would have been necessary to create these kinds of paintings. So one thing that I noticed really quickly in these pieces is that they tend to have a lot of like cool gray colors. So there's probably not a really warm light source on them. So I'm going to say they tend to be cool. I don't see a lot of like harsh candlelight. I do see usually pretty clear light and shadow patterns, but I don't think it's so hard that it looks like a harsh sunny day was necessary. You can also note things like, does the lighting look like it's kind of coming in from an angle? Does it look like it's straight on? Is it straight overhead? Does the light feel really dim? There's all different kinds of ways in which you can elaborate on this. All right, next, let's go ahead and talk about the brushwork that you're seeing. So for instance, one thing that you might notice is perhaps you see really square-edged brush marks that almost look rectangular in your painting. Well, this indicates that someone was probably using a flat. Or maybe the brush marks look really raggedy, they're not super symmetrical and even. That suggests it's a more natural hair brush. Maybe you can detect a whole lot of dry brush work. You know, the brushwork looks almost like it's pastel. Or perhaps there's a really wet quality to the paint that you need to note. For me, I would say the thing that I tend to notice most on the work that I'm drawn to is that the paint has like a real wet feeling to it. One thing I'm also noticing with the work that I have been saving that reflects my voice lately is that there is a real emphasis on impasto. That paint layer is built up pretty darn thick. The other thing I notice is that brushstrokes aren't really massaged out or smoothed out after they go down. I would say that's another really important defining characteristic for me. Now, similarly to brushstrokes, we can also talk about edges. So how hard or soft are the transitions between shapes? This is one thing that can really make your work look photographic. If you have a lot of hard edges everywhere, it's definitely going to feel like you're copying that photo reference. So really paying attention to where your favorite artists are softening or even losing edges can really be a very simple adjustment that elevates your paintings really dramatically. So for instance, in my desired style, I find that there is a real rhythm of hard, lost, and soft edges. I've talked about this in videos before. For example, Frances Bell is an absolute master of this. You can go watch some of my other videos where I break down exactly how I analyze those pieces, but off the top of my head, that one I know is going to be really important. I definitely don't want hard edges throughout. And I would definitely say that there are some harder edges in like the details of the face, and then it tends to soften as we go to the background. All right, next, this kind of goes along with lighting, but it's not exactly the same thing, and these are your values. So how light or dark do your colors in the painting tend to get? So is there a whole lot of contrast? You have extreme lights and extreme darks, or everything is kind of concentrated toward the lights? Or is it one of those situations where it's actually like a very dim painting that you might describe as moody? Feels moody because all of the values are really concentrated toward that dark end of things. I tend to notice for the paintings I like, they tend to skew a little bit more high key. I wouldn't say they're dark and moody, and I wouldn't actually say they're particularly high contrast. And then we come to color. So what colors do you see repeated over and over here? Some very simple prompts might be, do you see like neon pops of color, like a fire engine red or a like lemon lime color? Do you see an intense cyan, for instance, or a neon green? You might in your particular inspiration board, but for mine, I noticed that all of the color tends to feel very subdued, very toned down. So I would say mine would be nuanced, except for a few pops of color. I do notice a lot of gray-brown harmonies, but I don't really notice like neon accents. So the idea here is to go through these prompts until for all of the emotions or moods or narratives that you notice in your work, you can actually point to something very concrete through this workbook that made that possible. And the idea here is that these are very clear action plans that are designed specifically to tell you what to be doing in the studio. So if I really want to create portraits that have like an ethereal feeling to them, I don't just sit down at the easel and say like, okay, make something ethereal. Because how are you supposed to do that? Instead, I might say, all right, I want to make sure that I'm keeping the value of my background really light. I'm going to make sure I'm focusing on usually like gray color harmonies for that background. Because I want to capture the nuance of human emotion, I'm going to really crop in to the face. I'm not really worried about getting the rest of the figure. Because I'm not interested in conveying a narrative, I'm not really worried about what props or what background are involved. Those are essentially going to just get abstracted out into a very simplified background. And already this gives me a really clear checklist that I can follow, not only when I sit down to paint, but it can also help me choose what reference actually works best to paint from. So here's what I want you to go ahead and do now. If you haven't already, go ahead and start amassing that initial collection of inspiration that represents your taste. Don't let this become something that you're going to let snowball into days worth of work. I want you to do this in the next couple of minutes following this video. Don't overthink it, just do it until you know that your favorites are on there. Then go ahead and use the prompts to identify which of these you can elevate from taste all the way to voice. And just remember the prompts in that little Venn diagram that I shared earlier to help you really make sure that you're filtering that down successfully. And then use the prompts in the workbook to distill down the qualities that all of those paintings have in common to turn them into an action plan in the studio. When you actually do this, getting your references, knowing what to paint, and being able to bring those paintings to a finish is going to become way easier. And if you have a big goal for this, like you want to turn this into a body of work, or you want to win an award, or you want to get ready to submit to a gallery, watch this video next.